Hey, welcome back to Overhead Athletics. I'm Max Wardell. In today's video, we're gonna look at hip strengthening for FAI, femoral acetabular impingement. We know that that could be due to either a bony abnormality, soft tissue restriction, capsular restriction. We went through a video in which we talked about how to assess your hip to see what's going on. First line of defense, identify where you're restricted, where you're limited. Let's start to mobilize that. That was our second video. Here's part number 3. So if you haven't checked those out, you need to know how to assess your hip and how to mobilize your hip so you can get in the best positions possible, as well as stretch some of the soft tissue. And then we got to talk about how do we strengthen the hip. So now we're on our back. We know that getting into hip extension and maintaining hip extension is really important. And what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about getting into hip extension. So first I'm going to start with a posterior pelvic tilt, come up into hip extension here, squeezing the butt, driving the feet that way into the ground, not pulling towards my butt. So I'm driving down, boom, I drive down. Then if I can maintain this with glutes on, core on, all the way up into hip extension, then let's talk about doing it with one leg. Get the foot in the middle, one leg out straight, boom, get up into hip extension, squeeze the butt, 5-second end range holds, because a lot of times we lose the ability of the glute to work at end range hip extension. And if we have that, we can go into a very basic exercise that I see done all the time, and a lot of times done poorly, which is our clam shell. Have you roll forward as opposed to just doing it here and opening up. And what you'll realize is if I can't do at least 20 reps in a row, nice and control of the clamshell, I've got a real problem. So we can always do our clamshell, side-lying activities. We can add bands to that to increase resistance. But let's get on the feet, let's get functional and start to add some load. I got a pretty heavy weight here. Get in kind of that split stance, staggered stance position, and start to rotate down and across. Now this isn't a spinal rotation, this is a pelvis rotation to the outside of my front foot. Now realize this is hip internal rotation, flexion, and adduction. This is loading into the hip. If I have difficulty with hip internal rotation and flexion, identified in the first video, what I'm gonna do is I'm not gonna rotate so far across. I might just come to here and just say I'm gonna work on that hip flexion with a little bit of rotation. And as I get better, I'm gonna say middle of the foot and outside of the foot, which is gonna hit more of the fibers that I wanna hit. Spend some time with some actual heavy load coming in and out of the vectors that I need to be strong in, which is exactly what I need if I'm a throwing athlete, if I'm running and cutting, boom. Whatever I'm doing, I need the ability to have torsional strength to be able to resist excessive internal rotation and power into external rotation. So that's what we're doing right here with our kettlebell exercise. But understand, we're not against anything on the floor with end range contraction of the glutes or even just our basic clamshells, because we know a lot of our athletes are weak in those vectors. And if you can't do 15 and you're some sort of high level athlete, I'm going to tell you, you're not as high level as you think you are. So get doing your basic exercises, progress into your more advanced hypertrophy variations, and then let's start to load the anterior hip with a little bit different vector as well. We got a nice high box here. You can use a plyo box, whatever. Foot up on the box. I can try to keep this leg straight, or I can do bent. If we identified in the beginning of the assessment that I'm limited in hip extension, all right, get my leg straight, start to come into a nice little foot up style of lunge here. If I'm limited in the rectus femoris quad length, which we identified in the first one, let that leg bend, start to do some isometrics, chest up nice and tall, load the front of this hip. Another one I've stolen from the ready state, and I can add some load to this. For this first one, we've stolen a lot of these things from overseas, from the Eastern Bloc countries, as far as how they load their athletes. But I can hold this as an isometric, load in the front of the hip, don't let the pelvis tilt forward. I can also go overhead and challenge myself even more, or I can step forward and start to come into hip extension with a load. And then if I want to progress my last exercise, down and across for the front hip, internal rotation. Just some ways we start to load that hip into some different variations. We can talk about our hip circle, Theraband, feet forward, lateral walking. Now the thing with lateral walking is toes have to stay forward. Now, not only do the toes have to stay forward when I'm walking here, but I also keep tension on this band all the time. So the exercise is not this. Likewise, the exercise is not these huge steps, and there's no dragging of the back foot. So I'm nice controlled. Keep in mind, my upper body stays vertical. I never lean back over the back foot because I'm working this back hip as much as I'm working the front hip, maybe more. As I step forward, my center of mass stays between my feet to work both sides evenly. This is a great finisher for my lower body exercises. And if I put it around the feet, I work that external rotation component, which is a different exercise, just a bit more. Up around the knees, another variation to work a little different aspect to resist that caving in motion of the knees. We have a lot of options here. The idea here is load the hip in extension, load the hip into abduction, load the hip into internal and out into external rotation, and don't forget to load at end range hip extension, which is our idea with the bridging and the single leg bridging. Here's some variations that I see almost all my athletes weekend, particularly my athletes that have hip pain. If I notice that, hey, I'm having a little impingement when I go here, or I'm having a little impingement with the foot back on the bench, I just stay away from those variations and progress towards them later on. It's not that I need to stay away from forever, but it may not be what I do initially. Otherwise, stay tuned for the next video. Make sure to go back and watch the first 2 parts in this 3-part series. We'll see you guys in the next one.